Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Law and Legitimacy. Since we met yesterday, there has been really fascinating developments in the news around the world. You may have missed the story on the Tiddlywinks Championship going on in Reykjavik, Iceland, where Greta Thunberg is playing a game right now in the seventh and decisive round of Tiddlywinks against someone who doesn't believe that climate change is real. Activists throughout the world are burning items in the streets to increase carbon fumes, hopefully to affect Greta's competitor. They believe that if they can put enough stuff into her head and obstruct her airwaves and the transfer of oxygen from her bloodstream to her brain, she might be learning impaired sufficient for Greta to win and thereby win the Tiddlywinks Cup. That is the ability to tell the rest of us how to live and what to do in each and every moment of our lives. But we'll talk more about that later. There was some relatively insignificant news last night.
Photographer says, "How dare you? How dare you?"
At 5 o'clock last night, a prosecutor working with Jack Smith by designation walked to the bench in a packed courtroom and presented a judge with a sealed indictment. And that indictment, the judge signed a summons authorizing the arrest of, we believe to be but one person. The indictment was ordered sealed, but it was leaked somehow momentarily, and we now learned that the United States of America has taken aim at Donald Trump. Not that any of us were surprised. We'd been calling it here for months. I'm surprised it took as long as it did. But having had a chance to read through the indictment, I'm surprised. It's not what I had expected. I thought they might bring a seditious conspiracy charge against Donald Trump, claiming that he somehow orchestrated the events on January 6th. But they don't. They walk away from that theory. And that was probably to the relief of those who stood between the White House and the crowd that day. Roger Stone, Allie Alexander, my client Alex Jones, and others. Because for years, the thinking on the Hill has been that the White House directed the events of January 6th, and millions of dollars have been spent trying to prove a link from the White House to the street level events. And this indictment suggests that the government has finally given up the ghost on that and implicitly adopted, at least in part, the theory that the Proud Boys and others advanced at trial. This was no top-down conspiracy. It was a spontaneous riot. Indeed, in Jack Smith's indictment, the events on the 6th are not referred to as an insurrection, but are referred to as a riot. And that takes on additional significance in the Trump case, because I believe it's Section 3 of the 14th Amendment talks about a disqualifying event being taking up arms or engaging in insurrection against the United States. So Trump has not been charged with that. But what has he been charged with? I think we should refer to this indictment as the disinformation indictment. The federal government has turned a new page in its prosecution of dissent, in this case, of Donald Trump. And the marquee charge here is the charge that he engaged in a conspiracy to defraud the United States government. And this arises under 18 United States Code, Section 371. Now, most of us, when we think of defrauding, we think of the guy, trying to sell us aluminum siding for our stone house. You need that aluminum siding. It'll keep those stones alive forever. Scientific studies show that stones can be eroded by water. Aluminum, it might take 1 million years, but you can help push off the erosion with our brilliant aluminum siding, and we've got a special plan for you. That's hucksterism. But that's not the only definition of defraud, or what it means to defraud someone within the meaning of 18 U.S. 371. I want to read you some language from an old case, the Hammerschmidt case from the United States Supreme Court in 1924. This gives a definition of what defraud would mean in a prosecution of this sort. To conspire to defraud the United States means primarily to cheat the government out of property or money. But, and that's significant, it also means to interfere with or obstruct one of its lawful governmental functions by deceit.
Careful.
Yeah, thanks. It also means to interfere with or obstruct one of its lawful governmental functions by deceit, craft, or trickery. or at least by means that are dishonest. It is not necessary that the government shall be subjected to property or pecuniary, or that is monetary loss by the fraud, but only that its legitimate official action and purpose shall be defeated by misrepresentation, chicanery, or the overreaching of those charged with carrying out government intention. So in this case, and I would encourage each of you to read it, it's pretty well a summary, a point-by-point summary of the contested elected terrain and Trump's effort to challenge the results of electoral votes in the contested or so-called battleground states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and so forth. The claim is more or less what Mike and I expected, that given the witnesses that had paraded in and out of the grand jury, the grand jurors were told, and they approved in this indictment, or they returned in this indictment, a theory that all around Trump, advisors and experts were telling him there was insufficient evidence of a new term that will now enter our lexicon: outcome determinative fraud.
What in the world? What in the world is that?
Outcome determinative fraud is fraud that determines the outcome. So in other words,
AKA we have identified, without defining, we've identified that there is a point at which fraud is statistically significant such that we will care about it, and then we will just overlook that fraud does exist, and we will actually assume that it does to a certain point, but we won't define what statistically significant level of fraud becomes outcome determinative, but we will use that against you in this 45-page indictment alleging 3 conspiracy charges for you attempting to figure out why such weird voting irregularities occurred in battleground states the night of the election. And I love in this first part, Norm, I'm just going to go on a quick rant. I love on in this first page where they say that for more than 2 months following Election Day on November 3rd, the defendant spread lies. But we know that it wasn't just Election Day, right? Scroll down, they finally say from on or about November 14th, meaning what, Norm? That there was a period of about 11 days where the entire country had no idea what the outcome of the election actually was. And why was that? Why were we all sitting on our hands trying to figure out what the outcome of the election was for 11 days following election on November 3rd?
Well, that
seems like a logical place to start for this. It's a huge leap in this indictment for them to say that for more than 2 months following November 3rd. Well, we didn't have any sort of idea as to what the outcome was for almost 2 weeks thereafter.
Possibly. I'm less disturbed by that than you are. I think that when you read through the indictment, you get a sense of what outcome determinative means. So there was a claim that in one state, 10,000 dead people had voted. That might have been a significant blip on the needle, and it might have been a large enough gap to determine the outcome. But in fact, while Trump was telling people that 10,000 dead people voted, state officials in that state had said, no, only 2 did. So while it's true that some dead people voted, not enough dead people voted to have an impact on the outcome of the election, and therefore it wasn't outcome determinative. And for Trump to say, and to continue to say and insist that there were 10,000 dead people on the rolls voting in a particular election, when those close to the situation, those on the ground, knew that it wasn't true, that would be an example of fraud, misrepresentation, or deceit sufficient to carry this element. Similarly, in Pennsylvania, Trump, Giuliani, and others had told the world that there were more votes than there were voters registered. Pennsylvania officials apparently informed the Trump administration that that simply wasn't true. But in spite of being told that by people with actual knowledge of the registration figures in the state, Trump and his associates continued to repeat that claim. And so the claim here would be that he knew things that he was saying weren't true, but he continued to say them nonetheless. And he continued to say them for the purpose of disrupting or altering the counting of electoral votes and the results of the election. And so that's why I call this the disinformation indictment. When I first read it, I felt like I was sitting in the well of the court in the Sandy Hook case involving Alex Jones. The plaintiff's lawyers in that case could not repeat the word lie often enough. Jones lied, he lied, he lied, he lied, and as a result of the liar, liar, pants on fire offense, he must be punished. And of course, the jury punished him. You get the same unitone of high-minded moralism in what I will refer to in the disinformation indictment. There was an objective reality and a truth that was known to those close to Trump. Trump chose to disregard that, and he chose to lie. And thus, liar, liar, pants on fire. In this case, lock him up, and let's throw the federal book at him. So I think that I view this indictment a lot. This case could have gone a lot of different ways. They could have charged Trump with seditious conspiracy and claimed that he was involved in others in planning, or that he joined the conspiracy on January 6th, 2021 to use force against the Capitol. And they may well supersede. We'll talk about a superseding indictment later. Moments later. But they didn't charge that. They could have charged fraud in a different context. They could have charged that he used fraud to defraud individuals, that knowing everything he knew about the election and the electoral results, he continued to go to the market, as it were, and solicit funds from people who believed him, thus basically engaging in fraud against them, making them victims. But Smith and company chose not to go down either the seditious conspiracy road or the what I'll call the wire or mail fraud road. Instead, they tried to claim that, and they did claim that the lies that Trump told, that the misrepresentations that he made affected the operations of government. And therefore, this political figure's use of untruths, his overstatements, his lies, affected government, and for that he must be punished. And that's scary, scary, scary. It's a scary road to walk down in the political process, because whatever else the First Amendment is, it has forever protected political speech. It has protected hyperbole. It has protected speech that abstract calls for violence at some future date. And it has determined that the marketplace of ideas determines what the truth is, and that the best test for a truth is an idea's ability to withstand the criticism, the withering criticism that takes place in the marketplace of ideas. In this case, perhaps
I just see, I understand where you and I respectively sit on this issue, and I still don't think it's that far apart.
I don't think it is either. I don't know why you're suggesting it is.
Because I sense a general reluctance to entertain that what Trump was attempting to push into the public consciousness may have been a legitimate concern for actions taken either. And I think that we have to be careful here to say that there was, some sort of organized effort, blah, strikes me in this indictment. I think the most salient aspect of this, reading through, yes, I agree with you that there, with your view of the disinformation indictment, and they can't use the phrase, outcome determinative fraud or fraudulent elector enough. If they could have just put 45 pages of those two phrases together and that passed muster with, a court of competent jurisdiction for this, they would have. I believe that. But what withering cowardice of local politics. I can't get over that there were validly formed slates of electors for both candidates in each of these states, and that we have the Federal Department of Justice characterizing those electors throughout this indictment as fraudulent or fake electors, connecting that with the efforts of the sitting president attempting to, and it's not like it's without precedent. We've covered this specific issue lightly, but we've covered this specific issue on a previous stream with respect to Michigan's most recent activity. And we looked back at the JFK versus Nixon, the 1960 election, and Hawaii sending an alternative slate of electors to DC and that being upheld. So there is precedent for this type of stuff. But it seems to me that if there's any failure of the American Republic, looking at just this indictment, it's that we have a general sense of cowardice, at least from my perspective, on the part of those in positions of influence and in positions of leadership, because ultimately it's like a widespread recognition. Media apparatus was so strong that if they were to make the wrong decision, i.e., if they were to forward the interests of a substantive challenge in their respective states to the validity of these elections, and they ended up being, well, that, that was a move that they weren't willing to make. And that's shown over and over. And that's without qualifying whether some of these things were right or wrong. But it's interesting to me that the government can be just very conclusive with these suppositions that
well, I mean, I guess I do disagree with you, and maybe perhaps fundamentally. I mean, my objective here isn't, at least initially.
I just remember election night, Norm. I'm saying that on election night, when we're watching the coverage and these things did change and these issues did crop up, this isn't something that was manufactured by Trump. What I'm saying is these issues with irregularities and the perceptions of impropriety and these widespread populist feelings that something was stolen or something was taken or something, and there's no one to account for it, and there's a total lack of transparency. These weren't fabricated by the Trump administration. These were actions and items that were newsworthy, and they were newsworthy at the point that they occurred. The issues with vote counters being pushed out of areas in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, but these are routine events in every general. These are routine events in every general election. I mean, these sort of.
Then perhaps we've never had transparency or access as a population, and I think that in and of itself warrants a heightened level of accountability, does it not? That people in these positions should be able to say confidently, as you are right now, people, these things happen routinely.
I think another way of looking at it is they do.
Of fraud that we have to absorb as a country if we are going to believe in the integrity of our voting system. But none of that is happening. It's as if
I disagree with you. I think plenty of that was happening. And I think, I mean, look, you may make great arguments that might fly in a political science classroom or that might make for an entertaining op-ed post in a local newspaper. But the fact of the matter is there is now pending in federal court this indictment. And this indictment has to be read on its own terms and has to be evaluated in terms of what proof that Mr. Smith can or cannot raise in the presence of a jury. And as this indictment reads, what it says is that Trump was aware of the fact that there was no substance to his claims that the results of the election were stolen as a result of widespread systemic fraud that was outcome determinative.
All I'm asking, Norm, is on that point, why is it that we just say, why is it that we just take without a shadow of a doubt that his knowledge is like he knew better?
Like, I'm trying to read the fucking indictment and explain it to people.
I get that. But this indictment now lists 6 co-conspirators, but doesn't name a single one of them as a defendant, right?
Don't get so far over your skis that this discussion just becomes more rhetorical and political noise online. That's not what we're here for. I mean, I do think that the indictment has to be taken seriously on its face, and that to simply dismiss it as partisan hackery, or to say, as Trump is saying, this is that wackadoodle Jack Smith, and it's just the corrupt Democratic Party, or to react to saying this is the tat for the tit that is Hunter Biden and the Biden crime family. That's to miss a larger point. And it may be, that's what's driving, in some sense, the motives of some of the players in this case. But those drives are unlikely to see the light of day in the trial that is to come. And in the trial that is to come, this indictment becomes Genesis, the book of Genesis. In the beginning, these were the accusations. And I think the claim is going to be not that there hasn't always been fraud. I mean, or that some people's hands on the thumb in unseemly ways haven't determined the outcome of elections. I mean, plenty of people say that, Richard Daley and the Chicago machine gave Kennedy the election over Nixon. And it may well have, and it may well be that dead people have always voted. But I think the contention here, and this is all I'm trying to say, and I'm concerned about it, is that at the point that Trump was making bold declarations about what happened in the states, he was told by people in the states that those bold declarations were not true. And he said it anyhow. He didn't say, look, the problem of dead people voting is a problem in American life. We need to clean up polls. We need to clean up the registration process to avoid the perception of impropriety, because we've had some dead people vote. I believe it was in Georgia. I can't recall the state. What he did say was, when he knew that it wasn't true, at least from people in Georgia, 10,000 dead people voted. There's a difference between 10,000 dead people voting and 2. And 10,000 could determine the outcome of an election. 2 likely did not. And so the indictment isn't holding or isn't suggesting that the standard for American electoral politics is perfection. It's simply saying that in this instance, the imperfections were magnified for political purposes, and it rose to the level of fraud and deceit in an effort to retain power when there was no credible evidence that he should have. Now, he continues to believe that there was, and he continues to believe, as do you and as do I, that there are problems in the problem of registering voters and monitoring elections. But on its face, what this indictment is suggesting, and again, this is an indictment. Presumably, there was testimony before the grand jury to support these claims. A trial, an open and public trial, will air these out. But on its face, what the indictment is saying is that Trump exaggerated, and that those exaggerations weren't innocent. Those exaggerations amounted to a lie, and those exaggerations amounted to a fraud. And those lies and that fraud was intended to disrupt the operation of government, and that is the peaceful transfer of power. And that's a serious event. And so I take the indictment dead serious on those claims, and because truth does matter. But what concerns me about the disinformation indictment is it's the first time, at least that I'm aware of in American history, that a sitting American politician has been accused of fraud for his campaign rhetoric and for the language that he used in advancing his interest in seeking and retaining office. And if this is permitted to stand, it will become an outer limit against which future prosecutions will be tested. And so will people who make complaints about immigration, for example, will those people be held to a standard that says you've given misinformation about that, and therefore you've sought to disrupt the operation of the United States government, and you're guilty of fraud? I don't know the answer to that, but I fear that this prosecution represents a precedent that is potentially damaging to the robust protection we've given to political speech in this country over the years. And it seems to come at a time when we have the Biden administration seeking to censor social media on the basis of disinformation and misinformation in the public good. It comes at a time when we've got algorithmic control of so much of our communication by big tech in cooperation with government, and concerns that we need to eliminate disinformation and hate speech, its close cousin, in the name of the public good. And now we have this marquee historic prosecution against a man who as sitting president advanced claims that served his political interests, and he's now being prosecuted for it. That's scary stuff.
Yeah. So
and
we've got a comment coming from Twitter. Taking the indictment seriously on its face misses the larger point of the weaponization of the DOJ. Lots of Americans are losing faith in our institutions, and how can you assume local election officials are telling the truth and the Trump camp is not? Which I think is a more articulate way, Norm, of making my point.
It's a great point. It's a great point.
That's what I mean by starting with sort of first principles with this stuff.
But that's not, in my view, first principles in an examination of a criminal complaint. I guess I betray my origins as a criminal defense lawyer. If I'm sitting with Donald Trump asking him, what does the fight to come look like? These are the bricks that the wall that he's running up against are constructed out of. What motivated people to place the bricks is something different. The Twitter comment raises a more fundamental question. I mean, I posted on Twitter a comment yesterday that hiss you hear, that hiss you hear is the sound of air being released from the American balloon, or the hit, or whatever, something like that. I think that this is the decision to indict Trump on these charges is a historic mistake. And really will unwind the republic to a degree to which we have not been unwound since before the Civil War. And the reason for that is that the very reason the Twitter commenter propounded, and that is we've got a situation now where many people don't know what to believe. They don't believe the DOJ. They don't, and if you're on one side of the aisle, and if you're on the other side, you don't believe anything that Trump and his people have to say. And the result is we don't have a common conception of right, or even how to determine what right is any longer.
Another example outside of this, I'm going to take it from Rumble. T-Girl, good morning. T-Girl says, we just went through 2 years of people who believe something about COVID and its origins, and they were dismissed by government experts. Who was lying?
Don't know.
And just another point on that about sort of the legitimacy issue or the crisis that we discuss almost on a day-to-day basis here about faith in institutions. And I think that perhaps you and I came at this indictment this morning from two different angles. And I think that's good, right? Because on the one hand, if you are advising President Donald J. Trump, you don't have the benefit of talking to him about the context, right? None of that stuff is going to serve him as
well. And here's the other question from a legal perspective. The context may never even appear in a courtroom. So, for example, some the weaponization of the DOJ suggests that the Department of Justice is engaged in selective prosecution, perhaps malicious prosecution. And so, can you bring that to a jury's attention? Almost certainly not. It's very difficult to question the motives of the government in bringing charges in a criminal court. It's paradoxical. I don't agree with that. I always say to the judge, but if this is the United States of America versus my client, if my client's motives are at issue, why aren't his adversaries? And courts sometimes say, well, the government's not on trial here. Well, of course it is. The government's brought the case, and its motives should be searched and inquired after. But the real issue here is one that jurors will never be given access to in a federal courtroom, and that is jury nullification. If in fact we don't have confidence in the Department of Justice to call balls and strikes in a way that reflect the real world, should jurors feel free to and be given the power to reject what the Department of Justice presents to them on grounds that they're engaged in injustice? And maybe I think the answer is yes, but the courts don't agree with that. But let's hit the pause button on this, because we're going to get to the legitimacy issues eventually, maybe not today, but I mean, I'm still transfixed with the indictment as a legal document. So right now there are 6 co-conspirators, but only Donald Trump has been charged. Why is that? It could be for dramatic effect, that right now they want the focus simply on Trump, and they don't want him to have the ability to deflect or misdirect attention. And it may be that there'll be a superseding indictment, another indictment adding defendants to the case. That is not uncommon. It's also possible, and I don't know who. I mean, the thinking is that 5 of the 6 are lawyers: Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Jeff Clark, the lawyer from the Justice Department, I think Cheeseborough, and Sidney Powell. I mean, talk about a deer brought into the prosecutorial headlights. There's Sidney. And then, of course, the 6th person, a campaign strategist and insider, your thinking, Mike, is that this is probably the chairman of the GOP. Yep. So these 6 may be charged. They may not. How many of them have entered into cooperation agreements with the government? How many of them perhaps have been granted immunity in exchange for their testimony, which may explain why they're not in the indictment? These are questions for which I don't have answers at this point. It's hard for me to imagine that Giuliani has negotiated immunity or has been granted a cooperation agreement. On the other hand, wasn't Giuliani in the paper just this week admitting that he defamed the Georgia electoral workers, who are referred to obliquely in the indictment? And might that be a sign? Might that be Rudy's way of saying, I've changed teams? It would be a bold move on the government's part, but I think it's a move the government might make to negotiate immunity agreements with these other five as a way of making an example of Donald Trump. So, I mean, I think that's something to keep an eye on.
I think we also are unaware of other agreements that the DOJ may have with those that are not listed as co-conspirators. But my thought is that perhaps Ronna McDaniel, because she appears, her reference to the GOP chairwoman appears a couple of times throughout the indictment, and in particular on the topic of the plan launched by the Trump administration, or the Trump campaign rather, to send a memo out to all of the 7 states listed regarding the alternate electors, or fraudulent electors as they're called. And there's, I think, what did I say? Paragraph 56, Norm, that I
it is, yeah.
In particular, where it struck me that that there wasn't anything sort of incriminating, I guess, from the way that things were phrased on the page in the indictment, but it was clear that that was a very specific reference to conversations had between Ronna McDaniel and the Trump campaign, and her cooperation, or her at least admission to the campaign that she would help facilitate the plan as drawn up to have the alternate electors pushed into or those electoral votes pushed into consideration come time for that to occur. The fact that she was earlier this year reelected as GOP chairwoman, that was a very hotly contested election within the GOP, and we can't for a moment forget that she is a Romney.
Yeah, well, a Romney. In any case, the politics of it, that's more your beat than mine, Mike. The law, that I find it a very troubling indictment. I understand people out there talking about weaponization of the DOJ and whatnot, and clearly that's an important context. But as a matter of law, and as a matter of criminal procedure, and as a matter of trial tactics, and as a matter of establishing legal precedent, this indictment will stand in American history as a bellwether event. It represents the first time a candidate has been prosecuted for misrepresenting the truth in support of his political goals and or objectives. And we've never permitted that, I don't believe, in any prosecution in an American courtroom to date. So I think if Trump's lawyers are thinking, and I'm sure they will be, a robust First Amendment challenge on a motion to dismiss will be raised as to the conspiracy to defraud the United States government charge. My old favorite in count 3, the 1512C2, obstructing and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding, has been charged against Trump, and focus there on the element of corrupt intent. Did he seek to do this for his own personal gain? He probably did. It probably will satisfy the element of corrupt intent. But the law is not
count 4 there, Norm. Just so we hit it, the conspiracy against rights. Am I correct in just sort of a layman's interpretation of that as basically Trump's attempts pursuant to the first 3 counts there amounted to an attempt to disenfranchise individual citizens of the United States of their right to cast a ballot?
It seems that way, and that seems awfully attenuated, and it seems like an add-on charge that's unnecessary. It seems, in other words, some extra calories on the cake in the form of an icing that's unnecessary and something that's already too rich. But on the C2 charge, the United States District Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia has a 3-2 decision in the case of United States versus Fisher that says that statute only applies to tampering with evidence. And so this will renew the urgency of the United States Supreme Court giving clarity to 1512c2. And I note, for self-serving reasons, obviously, that our certiorari petition is before the United States government, before the Supreme Court, rather, in the case of United States versus Lang. The government initially waived its right to respond to that indictment, but they were asked this week by the government to respond, which is a promising sign, by the court rather, to respond, that there may be some meat on those bones that the court wants to pick. So, troubling indictment on its face legally. I think that we've kind of sidestepped the political issues that I know interest you more than they interest me, Mike, and perhaps interest more of our listeners.
Like being interested in them, I think it's nearly impossible for me to take this in isolation, which I think is what makes what you and I do together really impactful for the viewers and listeners. Because without someone like you anchoring an analysis of this, what I would be drawn to discuss is admittedly fruitless. I think that
I don't know about that, but
I think that we are required in some way, shape, or form to analyze the issues as they appear in the indictment because it's real. That is the most real of everything that we can discuss. But I would be remiss if I didn't express my own frustration with the way that it appears. I think I shared with you that earlier this morning, and in the cover of darkness. I was just thinking about this from a sort of a broader perspective, and it's not obvious to me that we aren't in some form of a digital war against one another in a partisan way, and that perhaps the only way out of this, and out of this, I think defining this may be important. But what is 2024 election going to look like, Norm?
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be an absolute disaster.
And it seems like we are playing a game of chicken. One observation I can make from reading this is that it really feels to me like the Trump campaign was very close, or at least this indictment is a reflection of how those in power, how imperiled they may have felt in terms of their careers and their future in the Department of Justice and in the halls of Congress and on the Hill. It appears that whatever attempt was being made to coordinate state to state and to put these things under the microscope, perhaps the one of the things that the average Trump voter should take from this indictment that is positive is that there was a real pressure applied to the current administration before it was sworn in, but to the existing establishment. But for that reason, it seems to me, especially when we look at that Greg Price tweet that I had briefly on the screen there, and we look at the chronology of events, where every indictment that you and I have talked about on this stream has been, it's been on the other side of some sort of revelation in the alleged corruption or perceived corruption of the Biden administration or the Biden family. And to that end, it seems as though this is a very strategic war being fought on American soil, and that perhaps the only way out is for other candidates to be able to move in. But how do we even get there? I don't know. I'm pontificating at this point, but it doesn't appear clear to me that if we have a candidate like Trump who is unwilling to yield, which I'm grateful for that. I think that it's important that we don't have a system that's able to roll over someone as popular as Trump, right? With as successful of a presidency as Trump, despite the constant calls for impeachment, et cetera. But we also have a current administration unwilling to yield as well, especially in view of the palpable illegitimacy and incompetence that plagues that administration. So anyway, yeah, Cindy L says, doesn't that last charge ring a bell? I think so. That's why I brought it up.
I'm not sure I agree, but I just don't view the world as organized enough such that Smith can do his backhand in response to the congressional committee's forehand with respect to Hunter. I mean, I genuinely don't believe that people sit down at the higher reaches of power in the government and play this elaborate chess game with the rest of us as pawns, and Smith as pawns, and the congressional committee as pawns. I think it's an interesting point.
Contrarian view you hold, Norm. I think I just want to observe that. I think that may be among your contrarian bent.
No, I just believe that the universe is governed by chance, and it's a large place, and we find patterns in it that serve our purposes. And I'm just not sure that the ultra politicization of this indictment serves the republic, but it may be unavoidable, and it may be that we're cascading on our way down to something like dissolution in a civil war. I have to confess that as I've watched events unfold in the last few weeks, I'm just brought back again and again and again to 17th century England. And the events that led to the beheading of Charles I, the installation of Cromwell, the Restoration, the installation of William and Mary. All these events began in a century that started with disputes about theological concerns, about where to place an altar, about how best to take communion, about whether the people could participate in public prayers and so forth. Events that seemingly were insignificant, but represented larger cultural divides, and that when push came to shove, those divides resulted in civil war. The fact that we can't even engage across partisan lines in a civil discussion about what the indictment means without resorting to hyper-partisan quarters and accusations is a scary thing, and suggests to me that the legitimation crisis that defines our time is much farther and darker than we think. And so we will have lots to talk about in the second half of 2023 and into what will undoubtedly be an explosive electoral season in 2024.
I think on that point we agree. And again, I'm always taken with your ability to reference historical points of interest to bring some broader context to how small we are in the grand scheme. I think that there's optimism to be found in some of that, right? To get a little altitude on these issues. As unprecedented as they are, but I'm 33 years old, and in the history of the modern world, that is a tiny blip on the radar. So grateful to be here with you, Norm. Always appreciate your willingness to go to bat, and I think that we will continue to peel back the layers of this as new information is available. But we didn't get to here's Trump again getting in our way. Several other stories that we'll talk about tomorrow that I think actually were overshadowed yesterday that I'm excited about. So make sure to tune in. We're here every weekday, 8 a.m. On YouTube Live, Rumble Video, and on X Live. And if you don't catch us live, you can always find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Audible, Overcast, etc. Right? Wherever you find podcasts, leave us 5 stars or leave us alone. Norm?
That works. See you all tomorrow.
All right. Bye.